What's the better 22 long rifle round? The old school standard, the CCI Stinger, or the new CCI Uppercut? So for probably about 40 years, the CCI Stinger has been the recommendation that people use for self-defense in a 22 caliber pistol. And that was before like Federal Punch came out, before the Uppercut came out, before a lot of different rounds made for 22 long rifle handguns for defense came out. It was the Stinger. You use the Stinger. And this is a 32 grain copper plated hollow point. Now the CCI Uppercut is a 32 grain actually jacketed hollow point. And there's a big difference there because, you know, copper plated is basically a copper washed bullet. So you don't really have a whole lot of material there other than a very soft lead bullet with copper wash over it. As well with the Uppercut, that is a truly jacketed bullet. It's actually, I believe it is a plating, but it's a very thick plating the way like Spear Gold Dot does their plating. And I believe there's kind of like a band around these bullets so that there's a little bit less bore drag so that you can actually use a jacketed bullet, because that's one of the downsides to using a jacketed bullet for a long time. It was very difficult to do because, you know, harder copper will have more barrel drag and then you will lose a lot of velocity. But with this, there's like a band on the bullet so that you don't have as much surface contact to the rifling, so it should, you know, give you good velocity without much drag. So our CCI Stinger here, 32 grain, this is rated at 1640 feet per second, but that is a rifle velocity rating. And our Uppercut, also a 32 grain, is rated at 950 feet per second, but that is through some level of handgun. I don't know if it's a 2-inch barrel or 4-inch barrel, whatever it is. So, you know, being both the same grains, it should be interesting because this is what people said to use all the time. And this is a new thing. And what I want to know here is if the newer style with the actual jacketed bullet will do better against hard barriers. So I'm going to do my standard ballistic test, and I'll show that here in a minute. I do have rib simulation and all that in there. But also in addition to that, I want to do our arm bone simulation. So why that's important is a lot of people don't think about it. Like if somebody's in a gunfight and they're actually shooting back at you, you know, their forearm is going to be right there. Well, if you have to go through a forearm before hitting the thoracic cavity, you know, will there be a big difference between a plated bullet and a jacketed bullet? Will the jacketed bullet do better through something like this before hitting the actual thoracic simulation? And then in addition to that, I have some 22 gauge steel here. I want to see how these will do, if there's a big difference between that plated bullet and that jacketed bullet going through a 22 gauge piece of steel, kind of simulating a thin car door. You know, going through that before hitting the gel, and see if there's a big difference there as well, because that's something I'm interested in knowing. And to do this test, I'm going to use my 4.1 inch barrel Taurus TX22. It's actually the fastest velocity handgun I have in 22 long rifle. You know, I have like a Rough Rider and other guns like that, but this one actually shoots it pretty fast. So this should give us a pretty good velocity to do this test with, and we'll see how this test does. So let me show you the rest of this test. All right, so here's our test. We have our Stinger versus our Uppercut through our 4.1 inch Taurus TX22. So I'm going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy I get at the same time. Then I'm going to do our ballistic gel test. So what this is our summer attire test. So we have just 2 layers of t-shirt followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard at the back to represent hitting back ribs. You got to remember that it is a half representation of the density of flesh. So when we're talking 3 inches here and 16 here, it's more like 1.5 inches here and 8 inches here. So if we got 16 inches in this target, it would be more like 8 inches in a real living target. So we'll do that real world simulation test. Then after that, I'm going to do an arm bone simulation test. So the same test, we're just going to shoot through this arm bone simulation, which by the way is a 1 1/4 inch dowel, birch dowel rod. We'll go through that into the ballistics gel and see how that does with the arm bone simulation there. Then after that, I'm going to do our kind of our car door simulation test. So we're going to go through this 22 gauge piece of steel into the gel in our real world simulation and see how those do with that hard barrier test. And then of course I am going to shoot at the steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, so first up we have our 32 grain Stinger that is rated at 1640 feet per second, which really doesn't mean a whole lot because that is a rifle velocity. But let's see what we get out of our 4.1 inch pistol here. 1101, 1183, 1166, 1184, 1186. I'm going to throw out that first number because that was way too off from the rest of the average. But yeah, upper 1100s. That's pretty good velocity for those stingers. Now with our uppercut, my main concern here is if it's truly a jacketed, that will increase bore drag. That is rated at 950 feet per second. So let's see how this compares to the stinger. $989, $991, $1,010, $1,016, $948. Let me throw that one out too, because that one's way off from the averages. I want to take the most consistent averages we get there to get an overview of this ammo. So looking at this was a bit slower, but I don't think it's on account of the drag alone, because there's a lot less recoil with the uppercut. So I think it is loaded a lot lighter than the stinger is. So that's a very interesting difference there. I'm not sure how this is going to play out until we test it. So let's do our ballistic gel test and see how these two compare. All right, I did throw that chronograph up there just to hopefully get a read with these, just in case something weird goes on. So first up, we have our stinger. We'll see how our stinger does. Real world simulation. $1119 feet per second. All right, had to make sure I hit that. I didn't see it. And we have our uppercut here. Same bullet weight, harder jacket, but moving slower. See how our uppercut does. 1,010 feet per second. Let's go take a look. All right, so with this particular ammo, it does look like that jacket does help it a little bit get better penetration. I'm going through our rib simulation here. Take a look here. And we can see on the bottom, our stinger expanded right away, and that slowed it down a lot. And our uppercut on top, much smaller hole. So if it is expanding, it's expanding at a much lower rate. And I'm going to say it is expanding because I can see it being expanded in there. So through this particular real world simulation, we can see that 22 does have a little bit of issue getting proper penetration of, wanting to see at least 12 inches. And with my rib simulation in there, that is about right too, because with my rib simulation in there, what you get with that equals out to like organic gel hitting, the same depth. So this would probably play out these same numbers that you're going to see here in just plain gel, organic gel without the rib simulation in there. So what we got with our stinger is that only with the 5 inches, camera parallax will make it look like it might go an inch further than that, but from a straight on view, we're right at 5 inches, which isn't very much. Now, when we look at our uppercut, we're still only at about 9.5 inches. Now, I do think that uppercut would be plenty of penetration on a front-on shot. As we're looking at the stinger, I'm thinking it might be, but it also might not be. So if I just had to judge just a standard test right here, I'm going to say the uppercut looks a little bit better despite being a lot less powerful. So let's put up our arm bone simulation and see how these do in that type of test. All right, our arm bone simulation. So we have that 1 1/4 inch birch dowel in front of the ballistics gel to kind of simulate arms holding a gun. It's not the perfect angle, but that's the best way I can set it up. And we'll see if that makes a big difference in the penetration ability after going through something like that. So first up, we have our stinger. All right. I'm not sure that I even got a velocity read on that. Now we have our uppercut. Now theoretically, this harder jacket should help with something like this, but at the same time, it's less powerful. So I'm really curious at what it's going to do. Here's our uppercut through our arm bone simulation. Let's go take a look. All right, so I shot through that arm bone simulation. There's an exit hole out the back in line with the gel. There's no impact in the gel at all. So that's kind of interesting. The only thing I can think of is either it deflected up and went out in the woods somewhere, or it bounced off the gel. I'm not really sure what happened at this point. And I was not getting reads with the chronograph up that close, so I just took that down. So we'll try it again with our uppercut. I put the arm bone sim a little bit closer and straighter, so we'll see what we get here. Uppercut again. Now let's go take a look. All right, so we can kind of see what might have happened. I think it deflected up quite a bit. Very interesting. I'm gonna try to pull down this arm bone simulation. Let's take a look here at this. So our first shot with our stinger, we went through right there. And next one right here is with our uppercut, and it did go through, but there's not much of a hole. And we can see the second shot with our uppercut going through there, it's actually tearing through, not very cleanly. So I think that is becoming a problem there for that type of testing, that type of thing going on. It's not going fast enough. So with our stinger, we actually got more penetration through the arm bone simulation than what we did without it in place. With the stinger, we got, I'm gonna say 5 1/4 inches, so just a little bit more. But with our uppercut, that severely lowered that penetration. We're only at 3 1/2 inches. There's not much damage in that gel, and we definitely went through keyhole. The uppercut, that's where our stinger went through fine. So there's a big difference there. I mean, the bullet's poking in. I could pull it out right now after going through that rib simulation. So that clearly would not be enough penetration, even with the front on shot with the uppercut if you went through an arm bone. As where with the stinger, that's potentially still enough penetration with a front on shot, because we're talking, 2 1/2 inches deep through a real living target. Definitely not through a side shot through a bone. It wouldn't work through the arm bone from the side into the thoracic cavity. But maybe a forearm, I think the stinger could still do okay. So that's very interesting. Let's put up our thin car door simulation. I know it's a little bit thin for a car door, and we'll see how these do with our hard barrier simulation. All right, now we have our 22 gauge steel sheet up in front of there. I did place a little bit of a gap there, a couple inch gap there, 2 or 3 inch gap. We'll go through that into the real world simulation test with our fabric and our rib simulation, all of that in there. Theoretically, our uppercut should do better through something like this because it is a true jacketed bullet. And if it doesn't, I'm going to question some of the thinking behind making a round like this. So we have our CCI stinger now through our little steel barrier. All right. Now our uppercut, like I'm saying, in theory, the harder jacket should do better. Let's see how this does. Uppercut. Let's go take a look. All right, everything with that setup is really cool and interesting. You know, our stinger, our uppercut, they both went through that just the same. But we can see a big difference here. Now, I do see a little bit of fragmentation with the stinger. There's a piece right there that fell off there. But the core went a lot deeper. Let me take a look here at our rib simulation. They both look about the same going through that. With the uppercut actually looking maybe a little bit bigger. So looking at this, the stinger, I'm going to say looks pretty decent because it left a lot of energy dump going in that first 3-inch piece. It expanded and we hit about 10.5 inches after going through that. So that's decent performance. But our uppercut, all we got there is about 5.5 inches. So just about half. And really what I'm looking at here, all of this is on account of that jacket. You know, it's just, I do think it is slowing it down a little bit. Like I said in the beginning, I thought that there's less charge there, and I think there may still be. But even if they put the charge up to what the stinger is, I honestly think that would overpressure the round because there's too much drag, so they had to lower the power a little bit. That's what I'm thinking. Because it still looks like energy is king, velocity is king. It doesn't matter what you do to that bullet if you don't have enough power behind it. So looking at this as an overview of everything I'm seeing here, I would pick the stinger. I think the stinger is a little bit better choice. Now looking at our plain gel shot, when we didn't have the arm bone in the way or anything like that, yes, our uppercut looked pretty impressive. But looking at an overview here, I'm just not really liking, you know, that it's not going to go through really anything. So I guess I'll leave it up to you guys to be the judge of what you think about this ammo. For me, it's not for me. I don't think the uppercut would be something I would carry, but the old school stinger, in my opinion, is still doing pretty well. So let me pull all these bullets out of the block. We'll take a close-up look at them. Then I'll shoot our steel and see if there's a big difference in the shootability of these rounds. All right, so here's the bullets from our first phase of testing through our fabric and our rib simulation. So here is our CCI stinger, and that thing expanded out really big, and just the size of that expansion is why we got under penetration. Is just way too much expansion for that bullet weight, so it's just not enough sectional density for it to penetrate very well. Our uppercut here, you know, we have less overall expansion. We got some kind of inconsistent expansion, and being a little bit less diameter overall, I think it would gives it the ability to penetrate a little bit deeper. But it just looks very inconsistent, but didn't look that bad, honestly, with our uppercut. As for our stinger, it's just splat. Now our second phase of testing here, when we go through our arm bone simulation, you know, we didn't catch that first one with the uppercut, but we caught the second one. So looking at our stinger, this is through our arm bone simulation, and that really mangled it pretty bad. And that's fine, that's to be expected with a 22. Just means there's a lot of power going on with that. Has a velocity of a lot of 22 rounds going through a rifle, so it mangles. And then our uppercut through our arm bone simulation, yeah, there's just not much going on. And that first shot, I don't know what happened with that, but that was definitely what I would consider a failure. Now our third phase of testing through our car door simulation, both of them did about as good as each other when it comes to, you know, deformation and expansion. But the interesting thing here is I'm just not seeing a big difference between the stinger right here and the uppercut right here. You know, the size of those bullets are about the same after going through the barrier like that. And what made the stinger better was there was just more power there. So what I'm seeing with the uppercut, it's a cool idea, and in theory it's a pretty cool idea. It's just not what I would be considering actually working. It's kind of subpar performance with the uppercut, in my opinion. I mean, it did okay for its own power level, But the Stinger just is more predictable here. It just mangles up or whatever. Thus, you get a little bit more penetration in a typical situation, just a front-on shot. But yeah, even that expansion is just kind of inconsistent for me. I would either want to know what I'm getting every time, like with the Stinger, or go up to a bigger caliber rather than mess with something like that. That's just my opinion. So that's a close-up look of those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target, so I'm just going to get a sight picture with these and pop these off as fast as I think I can hit the target accurately. See if there's a big difference in my shootability. You know, the Stinger had a little bit more recoil, but at the same time, it's still a 22, so will that really make any difference? So here's our CCI Stinger. See how this stuff shoots. All right. That would put a hurting on somebody, that's for sure. And it shoots pretty good. Now our uppercut here. Didn't want to load that first round for some reason. It's weird. And that round is bent now. Let me see if I can feed it again. Oh, so let me get rid of that round. You seem like they want to get stuck in the magazine a little bit greater than the other stuff. Huh. Now it's not feeding. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, the uppercut's getting stuck on the feed ramp here. So let me take these all out. I'll be back in a moment and hopefully I can figure this out. All right, I switched to the opposite magazine. Maybe it was the magazine giving me trouble. But I did find another interesting thing is that both magazines, you know, normally I can load 16 rounds of the Stinger, but 16 rounds of the uppercut's giving me a little bit of trouble. So uppercut, let's see how this stuff shoots. I'm not sure if I missed any or not, and I will say there's a little bit less recoil with this. It's a more natural feel, but at the same time they're both 22s, so any increase in recoil is not even a big deal with that Stinger. So look at this. This is interesting here because stuff like this uppercut, there's claims about it. You know, it's a new self-defense thing. It's not wax, it's truly jacketed. It can do all these great things. And what I'm seeing here is, in theory, yeah, I can kind of see that, but at the same time, the downsides of it are that I don't think they can load it as powerful as they need it to be to actually do all these great things. So looking at this as an overview, I just don't think it's a good thing to go with something like that, because 22 long rifle is made the way it is for a reason. It's a heeled bullet, so the bullet diameter and the case diameter are the same size up and down the whole thing. So in order for them to jacket these uppercuts, they kind of have to like do something kind of funny with making the bullet kind of a weird shape. And it's just, I just don't think it's playing out very well because we're not getting enough power to do what I want to see it do. So I'm going to have to say I'm going to stick with the Stingers. I would still recommend the Stingers or the Federal Punch. Obviously the Federal Punch that I've tested in the past did better than this, so I would still recommend that. But between the CCI stuff, I would pick the Stinger, because even if you don't got adequate penetration, they hit real hard and they expand, and that could play a big part in stopping a threat, even if you're not hitting something vital. So I think the Stinger's a little bit better. So very interesting test. That's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.